If you've ever gotten a splinter under your fingernail, you know how absolutely ridiculously painful it can be. Why does such a small part of us cause so much pain? Well, the answer is because the tissue that connects your fingernail to your finger is very sensitive. The same is true in horses, except in the horse, instead of a fingernail, that tissue, which we call the lamina, is connecting their hooves to the bony structures in their foot. And these poor animals have to stand on those feet typically 23 hours a day, and many of them weigh over 1,000 pounds. So you can imagine just how painful it is when a horse has laminitis or inflammation of that really important critical tissue. It's absolutely unbearable. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. A very common, very risky, and sometimes deadly disease, and the number one cause of laminitis in horses, called equine metabolic syndrome. If you're a horse owner, horse lover, horse breeder, or horse veterinarian, I'm going to tell you what we know, what we're trying to understand, and how to prevent metabolic syndrome, or at least prevent laminitis. Because right now, almost 1 in 5 horses will fall prey to metabolic syndrome. So what is metabolic syndrome? Perhaps you've heard of metabolic syndrome, at least in humans. It's been in the news a lot in the last decade. It's similar to metabolic syndrome in horses, with a few key differences. In people, we worry about metabolic syndrome because of our risk for heart disease or type 2 diabetes, especially if it's untreated. So how do we develop metabolic syndrome? Essentially, our body produces too much insulin, a hormone that we normally produce in our pancreas that's released after we eat. However, if those excess calories are from sugar and starchy foods, we release a lot more insulin than we would if we were eating something that had complex carbohydrates or protein as the energy source. What's the consequence of releasing all that extra insulin? Over time, it means that your body has to continue to produce more and more insulin to be effective. Eventually, your tissues, where the glucose should be absorbed, become really resistant to the impact of insulin. And so for us, we often tip over into type 2 diabetes because our pancreas essentially gets exhausted and can't produce any more insulin. In horses, metabolic syndrome is essentially the same process with one major difference. It doesn't turn into type 2 diabetes. Instead, the thing that we worry about the most in horses is laminitis. With too much insulin coursing through their veins, the lamina, or tissue holding the hoof capsule to the foot, starts to degrade and die. The bones within the foot can twist or collapse and actually come through the bottom of the foot. In really severe cases, the hoof can fall off entirely. At that point, it's too late. At best, your horse will be lame for the rest of his life, unable to support its own weight or that of a rider without being painful. At worst, you might have to put your horse to sleep. Horses spend up to 23 hours a day on their feet, and a chronically injured hoof can be catastrophic and have a huge impact on their welfare. I've been interested in equine metabolic syndrome for decades. It all started when I was a kid, probably 10 or 12 years old, where we had a mare that developed laminitis after being out on fresh spring pasture. When the veterinarian came out, he explained to us that it was laminitis, and I remember him telling us it's something to do with green grass in the spring. But at that time, we knew very little about the process, and we hadn't even named it metabolic syndrome yet. I just remember how scary it was. We almost lost her, and she certainly was never able to be ridden again. Fast forward a couple of decades, and as a veterinarian and geneticist, metabolic syndrome has always been on the list of things I wanted to study, and now that's part of what I do. The good news is we catch these horses early and provide them with proper management. You can prevent your horse from getting obese and getting metabolic syndrome, and hopefully from getting laminitis. This brings up an interesting question. Do all obese horses eventually get metabolic syndrome? The answer is no. We do know that in the United States, 40 to 50% of horses are obese. Only 10 to 20% of horses have metabolic syndrome. So why do some horses get metabolic syndrome and some don't? We suspect that it might come down to their genes. We knew that certain breeds were more likely to get it when we started this study, like Morgans, Arabians, and Tennessee walking horses. But we also know within those breeds, there was still a lot of variation, and a group of Morgan horses could live on the same pasture in the same environment, and only some of them would get metabolic syndrome. This could be an example of what is termed the thrifty gene hypothesis, or the ancestral gene hypothesis, which was first proposed in humans to explain metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. The idea behind the thrifty gene or ancestral gene hypothesis is that ancient humans ate large meals to store as much fat as they could, knowing that food was hard to come by. And depending on the time of year and the food source, we often would skip meals or not eat a full meal for 2 or 3 days. We also had to work very hard to find that food. So we weren't eating too much, and we were exercising quite a bit compared to today. Fast forward, and humans have conquered the environment, and that's the problem. Now we sit around on our computers all day long and eat whatever we want, and oftentimes a fairly unhealthy diet that is really composed of a lot of sugary and starchy foods. We believe the same thing is true for horses. Although it's not proven yet, we've made great strides towards answering this question. It also is interesting because the ancestral gene hypothesis could explain why some breeds, like thoroughbreds, are less likely to get metabolic syndrome. Over the decades, they've been bred for traits like speed. And because these horses were owned by people who could afford to supply them with excess feed, it wasn't really a problem. But metabolic syndrome is not as simple as this breed gets it and this breed doesn't. We suspected that some individuals in certain breeds are at even higher risk, as I said before. So how do we tackle this? Well, the first research study that we did was aimed at collecting data from a large number of horses from 5 primary breeds, and then focusing on the genetics in one horse breed, the Morgan, and one pony breed, the Welsh pony. We collected data from over 1,300 horses and then narrowed it down to about 630 horses where the data was really reliable and we could make some comparisons. And we showed that both genetics and the environment are important. And then we took it one step further. We took Welsh ponies and Morgan horses and compared the genomes between those in each breed with metabolic syndrome and those without. We know that horses have about 22,000 genes in their genome, and we know metabolic syndrome is only controlled by part of them. It's probably not one single gene. It's not that simple. So how do we find the genes that may be involved? I always liken it to using a barcode. We go and for each genome, we generate information about genetic markers that are spread out across the genome. And these markers can look different, or the patterns in the markers look different. That's the barcode part. So essentially, we use statistics to walk along the genome and along the chromosomes to find the places where the barcodes look different between those horses that are affected with metabolic syndrome and those that are not. And in this process, between those two breeds, we identified about 3,000 genes that were likely different between healthy and unhealthy groups of horses. The next step is a hard one that takes a lot of time because we need to drill down in each one of those 3,000 genes and figure out exactly the changes to the genes that cause the disease. But we've made huge progress. We've narrowed things down from 22,000 genes to a little less than 3,000. So it's still unclear if and why each of those genes mattered, but one thing is clear. We know that getting EMS is complicated and your genetics are important. In another project we did, we also know that environmental factors are important. I've talked about diet and exercise and alluded to them. But what's really interesting, in both humans and horses with metabolic syndrome, we've now shown that particular chemicals that subsist in the environment, called persistent organic pollutants, also increase their risk. When we looked at over 300 horses and the environmental pollutants that they were exposed through the drinking water in their pasture, we demonstrated that particular exposures increase their risk of metabolic syndrome and laminitis. There's a lot more to unravel to that part of the story, but it is interesting because it's another parallel to the risks that we worry about in humans. For example, there's a reason we buy BPA-free plastics, and part of that is the risk for metabolic syndrome and cancers. So just to reiterate, getting EMS is more complicated than whether a horse is obese or not. It also depends on their genes and whether their environmental triggers are present and how those two things interact together to create disease. What does that really mean? Well, an example, horse number 1 might have a genetic predisposition to metabolic syndrome, but that horse isn't overfed and none of the genes are triggered by pollutants in the environment. And they do plenty of daily exercise, so they never develop metabolic syndrome and live a long and happy life free of laminitis. In the opposite scenario, horse number 2 might not be genetically predisposed to get it or have a very low genetic risk, but because they're in an environment with tons of pollutants in the water, grass, and soil, and they are fed too much and live a sedentary lifestyle, the genes that result in metabolic syndrome can be turned on, and these horses could have a very different fate, disease, and eventually laminitis. So in summary, it's a combination of genetics and lifestyle, diet and exercise, and pollutants that are important to predict whether or not a horse will get metabolic syndrome. But we're still just scratching the surface. We can tell you where in the genome and which genes might be involved, but what we're continuing to work on to this day is to understand how these genes at the level of the genome change what we call gene expression, or the level of RNA within the tissues. And some of the tissues that we're studying are skeletal muscle and fat tissues. And then we look at how the RNA, which is then translated into proteins, impacts metabolic processes. And we measure this impact in metabolic processes by measuring the level of different metabolites within the horse's bloodstream. Once we have all this data together, we hope to be able to connect genes to RNA to protein to metabolites and really be able to explain in detail what's happening at the molecular level. Why is this all important? Well, right now we diagnose metabolic syndrome based on what we call clinical signs and blood work, things that your veterinarian can see when they do a physical exam of the horse. But we know that is just the tip of the iceberg. And our research can take us even further as we drill down to the parts that we can't see and get clues about how their molecular dysfunction is happening and how we might be able to manipulate their metabolism to make horses that have already been diagnosed better. While we wait for this, what can you do right now? If you're a horse owner or a horse veterinarian, there are several things that we recommend. Number 1, try to prevent your horse from getting obese. It is very easy to overfeed horses in today's age. We certainly give them a lot of starchy foods and concentrates and grains. Most horses don't need any grain at all. They can actually survive on roughage alone. Pasture and hay should be enough. And of course, we always recommend a ration balancer. But we recognize that this is not the choice that most people make. And also remember, the horses did not evolve on fertilized pasture. Even horses who never have grain can develop this problem because the pasture is richer and has more sugars than what they evolved to eat. We also know that fertilizer and other organic pollutants put on the pastures put them at risk for metabolic syndrome. And so what that might tell you is that your high-risk horse may need to go out in a pasture with a grazing muscle. We don't want to just keep them in a stall because exercise is also another key. These horses should have plenty of exercise. And when we're not riding them or driving them or lunging them, they can get a lot of exercise by being out in pasture. So we don't want to take that away from them. So what do you do if your horse is already overweight? Get blood work done to see if they're developing metabolic syndrome. It's much easier to prevent laminitis if you catch EMS early. If you're a horse breeder, remember that metabolic syndrome is a complicated issue, and if you have a horse who's genetically predisposed to EMS, the answer may not be as simple as just don't breed it. There could be up to 3,000 genes controlling the expression of this disease, and it's really hard to breed away from 3,000 genes. However, in the future, we hope to have a test that will at least give us a higher degree of accuracy about a horse's risk of developing metabolic syndrome. If you had a horse that, say, had a 10% chance of developing over its lifetime, you might manage that horse very differently than one that has an 80% chance of developing disease over its lifetime. The answer is, as with everything heritable, is to identify those vulnerable individuals early and to do what we can to limit risk or the consequences of disease. With that, I hope this has given you a little insight to what we're trying to do with metabolic syndrome, and I want to thank you so much for your interest in my research.